"I know what you buried out west," he said gently, and the words landed on Georgia Shepard like a branding iron pressed flat against her chest. She did not breathe. She did not move. The tin coffee cup in her hand trembled once, then went perfectly still, because she willed it still the same way she had willed everything still for the past 3 years. The fire in the stone hearth crackled behind her. Outside, the New Mexico wind was throwing itself against the walls of the way station like something that desperately wanted in. Georgia stood with her back half-turned to Ralph Ford, her spine rigid, her jaw so tight it ached, and she thought very seriously about picking up the rifle that leaned against the doorframe and ordering him off the property. She thought about lying. She was very good at lying. She had built an entire life on top of a lie the way a homesteader builds a house on land that was never legally his. "You do not know anything," she said, and her voice came out quiet and even, which was its own kind of betrayal, because she had meant it to come out sharp and final and dismissive. Ralph did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice. That was one of the first things she had noticed about him when he rode into the Dry Creek way station 6 weeks ago, half dead from a rattlesnake bite, too stubborn to say so out loud. He had lain in her spare cot for 4 days sweating through 3 of her clean shirts, and he had never once raised his voice. Not in pain, not in delirium, not when she had to cut his boot off because his leg had swollen so badly that the leather would have cost him the foot. "Georgia," he said now, and he said her name the way he said everything, like it deserved to be handled with care. She turned around. He was sitting at the table she had built herself from salvaged pine boards, his hat on the surface beside him, his dark hair still damp from washing up at the well. He had been in the territory long enough that the sun had burned the back of his neck to the color of old cedar. His eyes were the particular shade of gray that changed depending on what light fell on them. In the lamplight they were almost brown. In the open sky they were almost blue. She had been cataloging that detail against her will for weeks. He was not looking at her with accusation. That was the thing that undid her. She had been ready for accusation. She had been ready for that particular look, the narrow-eyed, calculating look she had seen on lawmen and bounty hunters and men who wanted what was buried on her land. She knew exactly how to meet that look. She met it with a wall. Ralph Ford was looking at her with something so much worse than accusation. He was looking at her with recognition. The way you look at someone when you finally understand what they have been carrying, and you want them to know you see the weight of it. "I found the grave marker," he said, 3 nights ago when I could not sleep and I walked the South Ridge. I was not looking for anything. I want you to understand that. I was not looking for a dark past to hold over you. I was not sent here. I found it, and I have been sitting with it ever since, trying to figure out how to tell you." Georgia set the coffee cup down on the hearth with a sound that was louder than she intended. "And what," she said carefully, "do you think you found?" "A name," he said. "Daniel Shepard, 1863 to 1877, 14 years old." The fire popped. The wind hit the west wall hard enough to shudder the whole building. Georgia Shepard, who had not cried in 3 years, felt the back of her throat close up like a door being bolted from the inside. Ralph reached across the table and turned his hat over in his hands. A gesture she had come to understand meant he was choosing his next words the way a man chooses his footing on a crumbling ledge. "He was your brother," Ralph said. "And I think the way he died is the reason you are out here alone, running a way station at the edge of nowhere, and the reason you do not let anyone within arm's reach of you for longer than it takes to water their horses and send them on their way." Georgia pressed her back against the stone beside the fireplace. The heat of it scorched through her dress, but she did not move away. 3 years. 3 years she had kept Daniel's story pressed down inside her like a stone at the bottom of a well. 3 years she had smiled at passing travelers and collected their coins and answered their questions about the trail ahead, and let none of them, not a single one, see past the practical, efficient, self-contained woman who ran the Dry Creek station. And this man, This quiet, gray-eyed, impossible man who had wandered in half-poisoned by a snake and refused to die, had walked 3 nights ago up the South Ridge and found the small wooden cross she had made with her own hands, and had sat with it for 3 days before saying a word. She wanted to be furious at him. She almost was. But the gentleness was the thing she could not defend against. She had armor for anger. She had walls for suspicion. She had absolutely nothing to protect her from the way Ralph Ford looked at her and quietly said, "You do not have to carry it alone anymore." That was where the present moment cracked open, and the past came flooding through. Georgia Shepard had come west from Tennessee in the spring of 1875, when she was 22 years old. She had come with her younger brother Daniel, who was 13 then, and with the conviction that the territories offered something the East had already closed off, a second chance. Their father had drunk himself to death the winter before. Their mother had been dead since Georgia was 16. There was nothing in Tennessee except a rented house they could no longer afford, a handful of distant relatives who offered sympathy and very little else, and a reputation Georgia had spent years quietly dismantling, one piece at a time, because reputations in a small town are stubborn as crabgrass and twice as thorny. The reputation had started with a man named Caleb Morse, who had been 30 years old to Georgia's 19, and who had convinced her, with the particular charm of a man who has practiced it on many women before her, that she was the one, the singular, irreplaceable exception to his otherwise wandering heart. She had believed him for 8 months. She had believed him right up until the morning she discovered that the secret he had been keeping from her was not the small, forgivable kind. It was the kind that has a wife's name attached to it and 2 small children in a house 3 towns over. She had ended it immediately and completely. But the ending had not mattered to the town. What mattered to the town was the beginning, and the middle, and the story they had already decided to tell. So she had taken Daniel, who was 13 and fierce, and hero-worshipped her with a loyalty that she did not feel she had earned, and she had gotten on a westbound train with everything they owned in 2 carpetbags, and the deed to 40 acres in New Mexico territory that their Uncle Beaumont had left them in a will that had surprised everyone, including Georgia. The 40 acres had turned out to be rocky, semi-arid scrubland that sat at the junction of 2 main trail routes. It was not farmland. But a man named Willis Crane, who ran the nearest general store in the town of Hadley, 12 miles east, had suggested that what the junction needed was a way station. A place where travelers could rest their horses, water them, sleep on a roof for a night, buy a meal, and move on. Georgia had taken the suggestion, borrowed money from the bank in Hadley with the land as collateral, and built the Dry Creek station from the ground up. Daniel had been her partner in all of it. He had been 14 by then, tall for his age and all angles and energy, with their mother's dark eyes and their father's stubborn jaw, and a laugh that arrived without any warning and transformed his whole face when it came. He had laid the stone foundation. He had hauled the pine lumber from the mill. He had helped Georgia frame the walls and negotiate with passing travelers and learn, piece by piece, every practical skill the West required of a person who intended to survive in it. He had also, in the summer of 1877, fallen in with a group of young men from Hadley who had begun riding in a direction that Georgia recognized immediately and could not stop. The leader of the group was a 19-year-old named Cole Prentice, whose father owned the largest cattle operation in the county, and who had been given so many things so easily for so long that he had developed a deep contempt for anything that required patience or honest work. Cole Prentice had noticed that the Dry Creek way station sat at the intersection of 2 supply routes, and he had noticed that Georgia kept her earnings in a strongbox under the counter, and he had decided that these were interesting facts. He had also decided, with the kind of casual cruelty that privilege sometimes manufactures, that 14-year-old Daniel Shepard's admiration was a useful thing. Georgia had seen it coming the way you see a storm building on the western horizon. She had tried to speak to Daniel about it. She had tried more than once, and each time it had gone the same way. Daniel, who was at 14 years old in the grip of every hunger that age imposes, the hunger for belonging, for independence, for someone to confirm that he was already a man, had listened politely and then done exactly as he pleased. The night it ended had been an August night in 1877. She remembered the heat. She remembered that the air had been so still and so heavy that even the horses were restless, moving in their enclosure with that particular unease that animals show before something breaks. Cole Prentice had ridden in around 10 o'clock with 4 others, and their intentions had been clear from the moment they came through the door. They had meant to take the strongbox. They had meant to do it quickly, and they had brought Daniel along because Daniel, they had apparently reasoned, could get them inside without a confrontation. What they had not counted on was Georgia. She had the rifle before Cole Prentice had finished his sentence. She had ordered them out. Cole Prentice, who was not accustomed to orders from women, had made the mistake of reaching for the pistol at his hip. The single shot she fired had not hit him. It had been a warning fired at the ceiling, and it had done the job she intended. Cole Prentice and his 4 companions had run for their horses. They had gone. But in the chaos of those few minutes, in the dark and the shouting and the scramble of boots on the wood floor, Daniel had gotten between Georgia and the door. And Cole Prentice, in his rush to leave, had shoved Daniel aside so hard that Daniel had gone down against the edge of the stone hearth. He had not gotten up. The doctor from Hadley had arrived 2 hours later and had confirmed what Georgia had already understood the moment she had knelt down beside her brother and lifted his head into her lap and felt the stillness of him. She had buried Daniel on the South Ridge 3 days later because that was the spot he had loved best, where you could see 50 miles of territory in every direction and the sky went on forever. She had made the cross herself. She had written his name on it with a wood-burning iron because she wanted it to last. She had never spoken of it to anyone. Cole Prentice had never faced any consequences because his father was Edwin Prentice, and Edwin Prentice owned the sheriff. Georgia had gone to Hadley 2 weeks after Daniel's death and had laid out exactly what had happened, and the sheriff had looked at her across his desk with the particular expression of a man who has already been told what to think, and he had said, very carefully, that without witnesses, there was very little he could do about a tragic accident. She had ridden home. She had not gone back to Hadley except when absolutely necessary. She had kept the station running. She had kept moving, because stopping meant feeling, and feeling meant the grief she had sealed up inside her so tightly that she was sometimes afraid it would break through her ribs. She had been doing this, surviving by motion and silence and practical necessity, for 3 years, until a man with gray eyes had ridden in with a rattlesnake's venom working through his blood, and had somehow, in the process of simply being present and quiet and consistent, gotten through every wall she had built before she had even noticed he was inside them. Ralph Ford had come to New Mexico Territory from Colorado, where he had spent the previous 4 years working as a surveyor for the Territorial Land Office. He was 30 years old, measured, careful, and possessed of the particular stillness that comes not from passivity but from genuine self-containment. He had grown up in Missouri, the son of a schoolteacher mother and a farmer father, and he had been educated enough to be dangerous and practical enough to be useful, which in 1880 in the New Mexico Territory was about as good a combination as a person could hope for. He had been riding south to take a position with the land survey team working the lower Rio Grande Basin when the rattlesnake had found him on the trail 3 miles north of Dry Creek Station. He had known immediately what it was. He had done the right things, kept still, kept the affected leg below his heart, ridden slowly and steadily toward the nearest shelter. He had arrived at George's door at dusk, already beginning to swell, and had said, with a calm that she found both admirable and slightly alarming, "I believe I have been bitten. I would be grateful for a place to be sick." She had let him in. She had known what to do because she had read the right books and learned the right skills, because in the territory you learned them or you suffered for not knowing. She had cut and cleaned the wound with the thoroughness and lack of ceremony of a woman who could not afford to be squeamish. She had kept him cool through the fever nights. She had made the broth and administered the whiskey in careful measures and changed the dressings and watched, with a professional attention she told herself was entirely impersonal, as he made his stubborn way back toward the living side of the ledger. He had been a good patient in the way that people who are fundamentally decent are good patients. He was honest about his symptoms, grateful without being cloying, and he apologized exactly once for the inconvenience and never brought it up again. By the third day, when the fever had broken and he was eating solid food, and the color had come back into his face, Georgia had found herself staying at the table longer after meals than was strictly necessary, listening to him talk about the territory, about the surveys, about the mathematics of land that she found unexpectedly interesting. He had offered to pay his way in labor once he was back on his feet. She had accepted because the way station always needed work and because refusing would have been impractical. He had fixed the south fence. He had rechinked the gaps in the east wall that let in the cold. He had helped her manage 2 difficult horses and a supply delivery from Hadley that arrived short by 20 pounds of cornmeal, which had required a written complaint that Ralph had helped her compose with a precise and persuasive clarity that got her the missing 20 pounds plus an apology by the following week. He was, Georgia had thought with mounting discomfort, extremely useful. And he was, she had also thought, extremely kind. And he asked her questions, not prying questions, not questions with an agenda hidden underneath them, but genuine, interested questions about how she had built the station, about what she had learned, about what she thought of the territory and its particular beauties and difficulties. He listened to the answers with his whole attention. She had begun, without meaning to, telling him small truths, nothing catastrophic. Nothing that touched Daniel or Caleb Morse or the sheriff in Hadley or any of the real and buried things, but small truths that she had grown up in Tennessee, that she had come west by choice, that she preferred the silence of the territory to the noise of town, that she had learned carpentry from a book and masonry from a neighbor and cooking from pure necessity, and that she was prouder of the station than of almost anything else in her life, because she had built every part of it with her hands and her mind and her stubbornness. Ralph had listened to all of it, and then one evening, 3 weeks into his stay, he had said, "You are the most self-sufficient person I have ever met, and I mean that as the highest compliment I know how to give. But I have also noticed that you hold yourself at a distance from everything and everyone, and I wonder sometimes if it costs you more than you let on." She had told him that was a great deal of observation for a man who had just recovered from a snakebite and was technically still a guest. He had smiled at that, a slow, warm smile that arrived at his eyes a half-second after it arrived at his mouth, and said that she was right, and he was sorry for overstepping, and he had gone back to fixing the south fence. But the observation had stayed with her. It had burrowed under her skin and made itself at home there, and she had been walking around with it for 3 weeks, which was what had made her so completely unprepared for what he had said tonight. "I know what you buried out west." And then he had named Daniel. And now she was standing with her back against the hot stone of the fireplace in her own home, in the life she had constructed out of nothing and grief and pure will, and the man sitting at her pine board table was looking at her with recognition and asking her to let him carry it with her. "You cannot fix it," she said. Her voice was still steady. She was very proud of that. "Whatever you are thinking about doing, whatever notion you have taken into your head, you cannot fix what happened. Daniel is buried on the South Ridge, and Cole Prentice is probably still on his father's cattle operation, and the sheriff in Hadley still does not care, and none of that changes because you know." "I know it does not change," Ralph said. He had not moved from the table. He was being very careful about not crowding her, she noticed. He had apparently understood that she needed the distance. "I am not offering to fix it. I am not sure there is a fix. I'm only saying that I know, and I am here, and you do not have to work so hard at being the only person who remembers him." That was the thing that broke it open. Georgia had been the only person who remembered Daniel for 3 years. She had carried his laugh and his stubbornness and his hero worship and his terrible jokes and the way he had looked at the view from the South Ridge, like it was the first truly beautiful thing he had ever seen, all of it, alone. She had carried the way it had felt to lift his head into her lap in the dark. She had carried the weight of having failed to protect him, which she knew intellectually was not an accurate accounting of events, and knew in her gut and her bones, and her blood was the most true thing she had ever felt. She slid down the side of the fireplace until she was sitting on the floor beside it, which was not a graceful thing to do, but she could not stand any more. She did not cry. She had forgotten how. But she put her face in her hands and she stayed there for a long moment, and Ralph Ford did not move from the table, and he did not fill the silence with anything, and that was exactly right. That was exactly what was needed. When she lifted her head, she said, "His name was Daniel Thomas Shepard. He was 14 years old and he wanted to be a cartographer. He had been looking at your surveying maps in the saddlebag you left by the door. I found him at it twice, and both times he looked embarrassed, but he was not embarrassed at all. He was completely absorbed." Ralph was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Tell me about him." She did. She talked for an hour. She told him about Daniel's laugh, the one that arrived without warning. She told him about the way Daniel had laid the stone foundation of the station, patiently and methodically, surprising her completely because she had expected him to rush it and he had done the opposite. She told him about the morning Daniel had bargained successfully with a supply trader and had come back so proud of himself that he could barely sit still through supper. She told him about the hero worship and how it embarrassed her and moved her in equal measure, and about the way Daniel had followed Cole Prentice, and about the night it had all ended, every detail, including the parts she had never told anyone, including the 2 hours she had spent on the floor beside Daniel before the doctor arrived, talking to her brother even though she knew he could not hear her anymore. Ralph listened to all of it. He did not offer comfort in the way people usually do, which is to say he did not try to minimize or explain or find the silver edge of things. He just listened, and occasionally he asked a question, a quiet, specific question that told her he was genuinely attending, not just waiting for the talking to be over. When she had finally exhausted the whole of it, when she had spoken every part of it that had been locked up inside her for 3 years, she felt a peculiar lightness that was also, paradoxically, heavier than anything she had felt in a long time, because grief does not weigh less when it is finally allowed to be itself. It just weighs differently. It weighs like something real instead of something swallowed. She was still sitting on the floor. The fire had burned down. The wind outside had settled. Ralph Ford got up from the table very slowly, as if any sudden movement might startle her back behind the wall. He came and sat down on the floor beside her, not touching her, not closing any distance she had not given him permission to close, just sitting beside her in the low light of the dying fire, present and quiet and steady. "He sounds like he was remarkable," Ralph said. "He was 14, Georgia said. He was not remarkable yet. He was going to be." "I think," Ralph said carefully, "that choosing to be a cartographer at 14 and laying a stone foundation with patience and care, and following his sister into the Wild West without a word of complaint, sounds like the beginning of remarkable to me." Georgia looked at him. In the firelight his eyes were completely amber. "You are very good at this," she said. "At what?" "At saying the thing that is true and that I need to hear and making it sound like you are only stating the obvious." He almost smiled. "I am only stating the obvious." She looked at the fire. The last of the embers were red and slow. "Why are you still here, Ralph? You recovered from the snakebite 5 weeks ago. You have a position waiting for you with the survey team on the Rio Grande." "The survey team can wait a while longer," he said. "I sent them a letter 2 weeks ago explaining I was delayed. There is no particular deadline." "There must be something," she said. "There is always something that makes a person stay." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Yes, there is." She did not ask him to say what it was, and he did not say it. But it was there between them in the quiet, present and warm and impossible to ignore, and Georgia Shepard, who had not let herself feel anything like what she was beginning to feel in 3 years, felt it pressing against the inside of her chest like a candle flame pressing against glass. She told herself she would think about it in the morning. She got up from the floor and told Ralph good night. She went to bed and lay awake for an hour looking at the ceiling, and the hour was not spent in dread, the way so many of her sleepless hours had been spent for 3 years, but in something else, something she did not have a name for yet, but that felt, cautiously and terrifyingly, like the first breath after a very long time of not quite breathing. In the morning, Ralph made coffee, and she made biscuits, and they sat at the pine board table and talked about the station and the season and the state of the south fence. And it was ordinary and comfortable and completely unlike anything Georgia had allowed herself to have in 3 years. She watched him wrap both hands around the tin coffee cup, the way she had first noticed him doing in his sickbed days, and she thought that there were 1,000 small details about this man that she had catalogued without meaning to, and that the cataloging had been going on long enough that it had begun to look like something deliberate. Over the following days, something shifted between them, not dramatically. The West did not do things dramatically in the daily way, the way the East did, with its calling cards and parlor conversations and careful social choreography. Things in the territory shifted the way the land itself shifted, slowly and completely, so that you looked up one day and the landscape was entirely different from what it had been, and you could not pinpoint exactly when the change had occurred. They worked together more openly. Georgia stopped being quite so careful about maintaining the precise professional distance she had enforced for 6 weeks. She let herself ask him questions about his work, about the surveys, about the mathematics of land mapping that she found genuinely interesting, and he answered with enthusiasm and precision, and the occasional self-deprecating humor that she was finding increasingly difficult to resist. He told her about growing up in Missouri, about his schoolteacher mother who had made him read everything she could get her hands on, and his farmer father who had made him understand that reading was no substitute for knowing how to fix a fence, and how between the two of them he had come out of his childhood with an education and a work ethic and a fundamental conviction that no honest labor was beneath a person's dignity. He told her about Colorado, about the 4 years with the land office, about the particular satisfaction of survey work, of walking the territory and measuring and recording it, of making the official, permanent record of a place. "It is a kind of respect," he said once over supper, "to measure a thing precisely, to say, this is what is here, this exactly, and no more and no less." Georgia had looked at him across the supper dishes and said, "That is also how you listen to people." He had looked up at her quickly, something shifting briefly in those gray eyes, as if she had found something true about him that he had not expected her to find. "I had not thought of it that way," he said, "but I suppose you are right." There was a supply trip to Hadley that she needed to make in late September, a week after their evening by the fire. She had been putting it off, because Hadley meant the possibility of encountering the Prentice family, and every encounter with that world opened something up in her that she had to work hard to close back down. She finally could not put it off any longer. The cornmeal was gone, the lamp oil was critically low, and she needed salt and coffee and a new spare axle for the wagon. Ralph asked, without any implication, whether she would like company on the road. He said that he needed to post a letter to the survey team, and that 12 miles was a pleasant enough ride in September weather. His tone was entirely practical. But he looked at her with those direct, careful eyes, and she understood that he was offering something more than company on a road. She said yes. The ride to Hadley was 12 miles of the kind of country that made you understand why people came west even when the West was difficult and unforgiving. The light in late September fell at an angle that turned the scrubland gold, and the distant mountains were the deep blue-gray of good wool, and the sky was so enormous that it made every human problem feel briefly appropriately sized. They rode side by side without talking much, which Georgia had found was increasingly comfortable with Ralph. He was not a person who felt compelled to fill silence with noise, which was something she valued enormously. Halfway to Hadley, he said, "Tell me about the sheriff." She glanced at him. "You mentioned him the night by the fire," he said. "You said he did not care. I want to understand what happened after." She told him. She told him about going to the sheriff 3 weeks after Daniel's burial, about the careful way the sheriff had explained that without witnesses there was nothing to be done, about the particular expression on his face that she had understood completely and had never been able to prove. "His name is Sheriff Warren Dodd," she said. "And his campaign was funded in large part by Edwin Prentice. I looked it up in the county records at the land office in Hadley. It is all there in the public record. Nobody seemed to find it interesting." Ralph was quiet for a moment. "And Cole Prentice?" "Still on the Prentice operation, as far as I know. He has never come near the station again. Perhaps he feels guilty. Perhaps he simply found other places to be a coward." Ralph was quiet for the rest of the ride into Hadley. Hadley was a town of 400 people, a main street of businesses, a church, a school, a land office, and a saloon that did a brisk enough trade to suggest that 400 people in the territory needed quite a lot of help forgetting their difficulties. The general store was run by Willis Crane's son now, Willis having died of a fever 2 winters back, and Georgia got on tolerably well with the younger Crane, who was efficient and honest in his accounting. She was loading the wagon with supplies when she saw Cole Prentice. He was 22 now. He was not quite as large or as loud as she remembered, or perhaps she had grown into something larger than him without noticing. He was coming out of the saloon with 2 men she did not recognize, and he was looking at the ground in front of his own feet, and then he looked up and his eyes found her, and she watched the color leave his face. He stopped walking. She looked at him for a long moment, and she thought about Daniel, and she thought about the night, and she thought about what it had cost her and what it had cost Daniel and what it had cost absolutely nothing for Cole Prentice, and she felt the familiar surge of something dark and corroded that she had been living alongside for 3 years. Ralph was at her elbow. She had not heard him come up beside her. "I see him," Ralph said quietly. "He is not worth what it would cost," she said, which was a thing she knew and did not always believe. "No," Ralph said. "He is not." Cole Prentice turned around and walked very quickly back into the saloon. The 2 men with him looked confused. Georgia turned back to the wagon and finished loading the supplies with steady hands, and Ralph loaded the heavier sacks beside her without comment, and they drove back out of Hadley in the golden September afternoon, and neither of them spoke for a good mile. Then Ralph said, "You were the bravest person in that street." "I did not do anything," she said. "Yes, you did," he said. "You looked at him and you did not break, and that is a kind of courage that does not make noise but matters enormously." Georgia kept her eyes on the road. "I have been practicing not breaking for a long time." "I know," he said. "I think you can stop practicing quite so hard now if you want." She thought about that for the rest of the 12 miles home. The weeks that followed had a quality that Georgia found both wonderful and terrifying, which was the quality of something real being built, carefully and honestly, without any pretense on either side. She and Ralph had moved past the polite distance of acquaintance, and the careful distance she kept from everyone and into something that had no clear name but that felt, when she let herself look directly at it, like the beginning of the thing she had given up believing was still available to her. He was not Caleb Morse. She knew this with a certainty that she could not entirely account for except to say that she had learned the difference between a man who performs attention and a man who genuinely pays it. Ralph Ford paid attention the way he paid attention to land measurements. Precisely, consistently, without drama, because accuracy mattered to him. He told her one evening, when they were sitting on the porch after supper watching the sun go down over the western ridge, that he had been engaged once, 4 years ago in Colorado. He said it plainly, without guarding the information the way people guard painful things. She asked what had happened. He said that her name was Clara, and that she had been a good woman, and that she had decided she was not willing to live in the territory and had gone back east to her family, and that the parting had been honest and sad, and had confirmed for him that the territory was where he needed to be, and that he needed to be with someone who understood that without needing to be convinced. It was not a betrayal, he said. It was an honest incompatibility. I respected her for being honest about it. Georgia thought about Caleb Morse, who had not been honest about anything. People are not always honest about incompatibilities, she said. No, he said, they are not. I was not always when I was younger. I learned the cost of that. She looked at him. The sunset was laying copper and amber over everything, over the scrubland and the distant mountains and the porch boards and the plains of his face. He was looking at the western horizon with an expression that was wholly open, no guard on it at all, and she thought that she had never in her adult life encountered a man who was so simply, unguardedly himself. "Ralph," she said. He looked at her. "I need to say something and I need you to hear it fully." "I am listening," he said. "I have been alone for 3 years by choice, not by accident. I built this station, and I built this life exactly the way I wanted it because I needed to do something that was entirely mine, something that could not be taken away or undermined or claimed by anyone else. And I am not willing to give that up, not for anyone. If that is a difficult thing to want, I understand." He was quiet for a moment, and she watched him take the full weight of what she had said. "Georgia," he said, "the last thing in the world I want is to take something from you. I am not a man who measures his worth by what he can possess or control. What I am is a man who thinks you are the most extraordinary person I have met in 30 years of living, and who would like, if you are willing, to be beside you rather than apart from you. Not instead of what you have built, in addition to it." The sunset stretched across the sky in shades she did not have words for. "That is a very specific thing to want," she said. "I am a surveyor," he said. "Precision is my professional obligation." She laughed. It surprised both of them. It was a real laugh, unguarded and sudden, the kind she had almost forgotten she was capable of. He was smiling at her with the full, slow warmth of it, and the evening was golden and wide and real, and Georgia Shepard thought that perhaps being open to something did not necessarily mean losing what she had built. Perhaps sometimes it meant adding to it. She reached across the porch boards and put her hand over his, and he turned his palm up and held her hand with the same care he applied to everything. And they sat there until the last of the sunset was gone, and the stars came out over the New Mexico territory in their extravagant thousands. October came with cooler nights and crisper days, and a rash of travelers heading south before the weather turned, which meant the station was busier than usual in Georgia, and Ralph worked alongside each other from early morning to late evening, with an easy rhythm that felt so natural it was almost startling. A family came through from Kansas, a man and his wife and 4 children, heading to the Rio Grande Valley. The mother was exhausted in the way of someone who has been moving for weeks on insufficient sleep, and Georgia sat with her at the table after supper while the children slept on the spare cots, and the husband tended the horses, and they talked about the particular difficulty of moving toward a future that was not yet formed, not yet real. "Do you not find it lonely out here?" the woman asked, looking around the station with the expression of someone for whom 4 walls and a roof represented a precious achievement. Georgia had been about to give the answer she always gave, the practical, cheerful, self-sufficient answer, that she liked the solitude, that she kept busy, that the travelers provided all the company she needed. Instead, she glanced at Ralph, who was at the far end of the room going over a map with the woman's husband, and said, "It is less lonely than it was." The family moved on in the morning. Georgia watched them go from the porch and felt a warmth that she recognized as the warmth of her own life being worth something, not only to her but to other people, which was a feeling she had not allowed herself in a long time. Ralph came and stood beside her on the porch. "You are good with people," he said. "You make them feel safe. That is not a small thing, especially out here." "I learned it from necessity," she said. "Most good things are learned that way," he said. She looked up at him because he was a few inches taller and she had to look up, and she thought that the want she was feeling was uncomplicated in a way she had been afraid want could never be again after Caleb Morse. It was just honest and warm and present, like a fire that is burning safely in a stone hearth, contained and reliable and real. "Ralph," she said, "yes. I think I should tell you that I trust you." He looked at her with the full weight of those gray eyes. "I know," he said. "I know because you have been letting yourself trust me for weeks, and I have been aware of it and grateful for it every day." "I wanted to say it plainly," she said, "because I do not say plain things enough." "I think," he said, "that you say very plain things. You just say them quietly, and most people are not paying close enough attention." She kissed him then. She decided to, clearly and without hesitation, the way she made every other important decision, after careful thought and with complete commitment. She stepped up onto the first porch step so that the height differential was less dramatic, and she put her hands on either side of his face and kissed him. And he kissed her back with the same quality he brought to everything, attentive and unhurried and completely present. And the morning light of the New Mexico territory fell over them like something that had been waiting to happen. When she stepped back, she felt the rightness of it settled all through her, the same settled feeling she had felt on the morning the station was finished, the morning she had stood back and looked at what she had built and known that it was good. "Well," Ralph said, and his voice was slightly lower than usual. "Well," Georgia agreed. "I should perhaps mention," he said, with a care that she recognized as him being precise about something important, "that my feelings for you have been clear to me for some time, since before the night by the fire, probably since the third week if I am being accurate. I did not say anything because it was not my place to push." "That was the right decision," she said. "I thought so," he said. "Do not stop making right decisions," she said. He smiled, and there it was again, that slow amber warmth of it. "I will do my best." November brought the cold, and with it a letter from the survey team on the Rio Grande, which Ralph showed her with his characteristic directness. They were asking when he would arrive. The position was still available, but the window was not unlimited. There was a new survey beginning in the spring that they wanted him for specifically. Georgia read the letter at the table and felt the old cold thing move through her chest, the thing that said, "Here it is, the thing you trusted, leaving." She set the letter down. "You have to go," she said. "I do not have to do anything," Ralph said. "But I should tell you what I am thinking so you can tell me what you are thinking and we can figure out the rest from there." "All right," she said. "The survey position is important to me," he said. "The work matters to me, but it is not a position that requires me to be permanently absent from here. The lower Rio Grande Basin is a 6-month survey, after which I would have completed my obligations to the team and would have options." "What kind of options?" "Well," he said, studying the surface of the table with the focused attention of a man measuring something, "I was thinking that a way station at the intersection of two major trail routes, with 40 acres of territory that could potentially be expanded and improved, and that is run by the most capable and intelligent person in the county, might benefit from someone with land survey expertise and a certain willingness to do whatever work needs doing." Georgia looked at him for a long moment. "You are talking about coming back," she said. "I am talking about asking you a question," he said, "but I wanted to give you the context first." He reached into his vest pocket and produced a ring. It was simple and unadorned, a plain silver band, and he had clearly had it made at some point without her knowledge. And the fact of it, the fact that he had thought carefully enough and hoped specifically enough to have it made, undid something in her completely. "Georgia Shepard," he said, "I am asking you to marry me. Not because I want to own any part of what you have built, and not because I think you need rescuing from anything, and not because I am afraid of what the world will think. I am asking because I love you, and because you are the place I want to come home to, and because I think we would be extraordinary together, and because I have not wanted anything this clearly or this completely in my entire life." She looked at the ring, and she looked at his face, and she thought about Daniel on the South Ridge, and she thought about the night by the fire, and she thought about everything she had built and everything she had survived, and she said, "Yes." He put the ring on her finger, and she looked at it in the November light coming through the window, and she thought that it was exactly right, plain and durable, and made to last. They were married on a clear December morning in 1880 at the Hadley Church, with Willis Crane's son as one witness and a traveling minister who came through twice a year as the officiant, and a rancher's wife named Mee Donahue, whom Georgia had spoken to occasionally in Hadley and who had always been kind, as the second witness. It was a small ceremony and a practical one, and it was exactly what they both wanted. Georgia wore a dress she had made herself from blue wool she had ordered from a catalog, because blue was the color of the territory sky that she loved, and because she was done with things that did not fit her and had been for some time. Ralph wore his good coat and his cleanest shirt, and looked at her through the whole ceremony with an expression that she would remember for the rest of her life. After the ceremony, Mee Donahue hugged Georgia and whispered that she looked happier than Mee had ever seen another woman look, and Georgia said that she felt that way, and that she had not expected to, and that it was wonderful and terrifying in equal measure, and Mee laughed and said that that was exactly how it was supposed to feel. Ralph rode south to the Rio Grande in January of 1881, carrying a letter from Georgia in his saddlebag that she had written at the pine table by lamplight, in her careful, precise hand, telling him a long and detailed account of everything she was thinking, because she had discovered, in the month since the night by the fire, that she had a great deal she wanted to say, now that she had someone to say it to. He wrote her back from every town the survey passed through, letters that were detailed and funny and honest, that described the land and the work and the occasional difficulty of living in a surveying camp with men who had very different ideas about what constituted adequate coffee, and that always ended with his love stated plainly, in the same way he stated everything. She ran the station through the winter and the spring. She had a good season, more travelers than the previous year, word having spread along the trail routes that Dry Creek was reliable and the proprietor was competent. She repaired the north fence and expanded the horse enclosure and started a small kitchen garden on the east side of the station that she had been meaning to do for years. She went up to the South Ridge one evening in late February, when the light was long and clear, and the territory was showing the first tentative signals of spring. She sat beside Daniel's grave and she talked to him for a while. She told him about Ralph, about the survey and the letters and the silver ring. She told him that she thought Ralph would have liked him enormously, and that Daniel would have liked Ralph, with his surveying maps and his mathematical precision, and his gentle, unhurried way of being present. She told Daniel that she was all right, that she had not forgotten him and would not forget him, not for a single day of her life, that carrying his absence was still the hardest thing she did, and that she suspected it would always be the hardest thing, but that she was not carrying it alone anymore, and that made the difference between something bearable and something unbearable. The spring wind came across the ridge and moved through the dry grass with a sound that was almost a voice, and Georgia sat with her brother for a long time before she went back down to the station. Ralph came back in July of 1881, arriving at the Dry Creek station in the long golden light of a July evening with his horse and his surveying equipment, and a pair of saddlebags considerably fuller than when he had left, because he had apparently been collecting small, useful things throughout the territory that he thought might serve the station or please Georgia. There were 2 new books on practical agriculture. There was a detailed topographic survey he had made of the full 40 acres, showing every elevation and water source and drainage pattern, which was the most useful and the most romantic gift she had ever received in her life. And she told him so, and he laughed, and she kissed him properly on the porch in the July evening, and he pulled her close with his arms around her, and they stood there long enough that the horses grew bored and wandered off toward the water trough without being led. He told her that evening, sitting at the pine table in the lamplight, that he had spoken to 2 men on the survey team who were also licensed to conduct county land surveys, and that there was sufficient demand in the Hadley County area for an independent surveyor to make a reasonable and consistent living. He had already written to the county land office in Hadley and received a positive preliminary response. "You are going to set up practice here," she said. "If you want that," he said. "I want it," she said. "I want you here. I want all of it." "Good," he said. "Because I have also," he paused to take something from his vest pocket and lay it on the table, "renewed the water rights claim for the East Creek tributary, which you had not filed for and which was legally available and which I filed in both our names." She looked at the filed claim document. "Ralph Ford. Yes. You are the most practical, romantic person I have ever encountered." "I prefer to think of it as romantic practicality," he said. "Two sides of the same reliable coin." She picked up the document and the topographic survey, and added them to the small flat box she kept under the counter that contained the important papers of the station, and she felt the deep settled rightness of a life that was being built correctly, carefully, by 2 people who understood what they were building and why. In the autumn of 1881, Georgia discovered she was pregnant. She sat with the knowledge for a day before telling Ralph, not because she was uncertain about telling him, but because she wanted to be alone with it for one day, to hold the fact of it and understand what she felt about it before she had to find words. What she found when she sat with it honestly was something she had not expected, a fierce and uncomplicated joy, alongside a fear that was not of the future but of the love itself, of how much she already felt for this person who was not yet a person, of how much there was to lose. She knew about loss. She was more familiar with it than she wished to be. She also knew, because 3 years of survival and 12 months of loving Ralph Ford had taught her, that the answer to the fear of loss was not to refuse the love. The answer was to love fully and to trust that if the worst happened, she would survive it because she always had, and to know that in the meantime the love was worth everything it cost. She told Ralph the next morning over coffee in her plain and direct way. He was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at her with an expression that she had no words for except to say that it was the most open thing she had ever seen on a human face. "Georgia," he said, and stopped. "Yes," she said. "I am," he started again and stopped again. "I know," she said. "I am too." He reached across the table and took her hands in both of his and held them, and they stayed like that for a long while, the morning light coming through the window and the territory stretching out in every direction around their station, their 40 acres, their life. The winter of 1881 and the spring of 1882 brought changes to the wider territory that Georgia and Ralph followed with interest and occasional alarm. The Lincoln County troubles had wound down, but the territory was still finding its shape, and the arrival of the railroad in various parts of New Mexico was beginning to change the economics of trail travel in ways that anyone running a way station needed to think about carefully. Ralph surveyed the situation with his characteristic methodical clarity. He pointed out that the nearest proposed railroad line would, if it came through as planned, pass significantly to the east of Hadley, which meant that the trail routes through Dry Creek would remain relevant for at minimum another decade and possibly considerably longer. He also pointed out that the growing settlement population in the region meant a growing demand for reliable land survey work, which meant his independent practice was well-timed. Georgia listened and appreciated the analysis and told him that she had also been thinking about it and had an idea. She had noticed that the families coming through on the trail increasingly needed not just a night's rest but information about the territory, about water sources, about trail conditions, about the towns and settlements ahead. What if the station added a service, a written guide to the route, something she could produce with Ralph's topographic knowledge and her own 3 years of experience and sell for a reasonable price to travelers heading south. Ralph looked at her with the expression she had come to love, the one that meant he was rapidly appraising an idea and finding it excellent. "You should write it," he said. "Your prose is already clear and precise. I can provide the maps." "We should write it together," she said. They wrote it together over the following winter months, in the evenings after the station chores were done, at the pine table by lamplight. Georgia wrote the text in her careful hand and Ralph produced the maps with his surveyor's precision, and they argued pleasantly about certain details and agreed deeply on others and produced, by February of 1882, a 12-page guide to the southern New Mexico Trail routes that was accurate, readable, and practical, and that they had printed at the press in Hadley for a cost that they recouped within the first month of sales. The guide was eventually copied and distributed by the Hadley Land Office as an official territorial document, which Georgia considered one of the greater satisfactions of her professional life. Their son was born in April of 1882 in the Dry Creek Station, with Meade Donahue serving as midwife and Ralph present throughout, which was not the universal custom, but was the custom Georgia had decided on because she wanted him there, and because what Georgia Shepard decided on tended to be what happened. The labor was long and the night was very full, but by the gray light of an April dawn there was a baby, a boy, broad-faced and astonishingly loud, with Georgia's dark hair and Ralph's stubbornness already apparent in the set of his jaw. Georgia looked at her son in the dawn light and felt the enormity of it move through her in a slow wave, love and terror and gratitude and the specific ache of Daniel's absence, which was always present but sharpest at the moments of greatest fullness, as if joy and grief had learned to occupy the same space. "What do we name him?" Ralph asked. He was sitting beside the bed, his forearm resting near her shoulder, his voice the careful, quiet thing it always was. "Daniel," Georgia said. "Daniel Thomas Ford." Ralph looked at her for a moment with full, unhurried attention. "Yes," he said, "that is exactly right." Meade Donahue went home in the morning, squeezing Georgia's hand at the door with the warmth of a woman who has witnessed something real, and Georgia held her son and looked out the window at the station she had built and the territory beyond it, and felt herself to be exactly where she was supposed to be. The spring of 1882 brought something else, something Georgia had not expected but had perhaps, in some quiet part of herself, hoped for. It began with a letter from the territorial governor's office, which had been reviewing county records and had initiated an inquiry into certain financial irregularities in Hadley County, specifically related to the allocation of county funds and the conduct of certain elected officials. The letter was a general notice, sent to residents of record in the county, asking anyone with relevant information to submit it to the inquiry office. Ralph read the letter at the table and looked at Georgia. Georgia looked at the letter for a long time. Then she went to the flat box under the counter and took out a document she had placed there 3 years ago and never sent anywhere. A detailed written account of the night of Daniel's death, the names of the individuals involved, and the subsequent meeting with Sheriff Warren Dodd, including every specific thing he had said and the date and time she had said it. She had written it in the days after Daniel's funeral because she had needed to put it somewhere outside herself, and she had kept it because she could not bring herself to destroy it. She placed it on the table beside the governor's letter. "I want to submit this," she said. "Then we will submit it," Ralph said. He drafted the accompanying letter himself, because his prose was formal and precise in the way of a man trained in official documentation, and because Georgia found, when she tried to write it, that she was too close to the material to be measured about it. She was not ashamed of this. She told Ralph so, and he nodded and picked up the pen and wrote what needed to be written with the accuracy and care she had come to rely on. They sent it to the inquiry office in Santa Fe in March of 1882. The process that followed was slow and imperfect, and ultimately incomplete in the way that official processes in the territory almost always were. Warren Dodd resigned his position as sheriff of Hadley County in June of 1882. The circumstances, officially described as personal but widely understood to be connected to the inquiry findings. Edwin Prentice was assessed a significant fine for improper political contributions. Cole Prentice did not face criminal charges, which was its own particular variety of injustice that Georgia acknowledged fully and then set carefully aside, because she had learned the difference between justice that was possible and justice that was complete, and she had made her peace with living in the gap between them. What she had was this: an official record that said Daniel Thomas Shepard had died as a result of an incident involving Cole Prentice and his associates. It was in the territorial record. It said his name. It said what had happened to him. It was not enough. It was never going to be enough. But it was real, and it was documented, and it would outlast everyone involved, and that mattered. Georgia went up to the South Ridge on the evening the inquiry results arrived, with baby Daniel in her arms, because she thought Daniel should know. She sat by the grave in the long summer evening and told her brother about the inquiry and the record and the resignation, and she told him about his nephew, who was already loud and determined, and who she believed absolutely would be remarkable. She told him that she missed him every day. She told him that she was happy, which was the truest and most complicated thing she had ever said, because it was true, and it coexisted with the loss in the way she had not understood was possible until she had lived it. She told him about Ralph, all of it this time, from the snakebite to the ring to the maps to the name they had given their son. She sat on the South Ridge in the summer evening with the view of 50 miles of territory in every direction, and the sky going on forever, and she talked to her brother for a long time. Coming down the ridge in the last of the evening light, she met Ralph halfway, because he had seen her go up and had come to walk back down with her, with the same quality of presence he had always had, not intrusive, not managing, just there. She handed him the baby, and he held his son against his shoulder with one arm and put his other arm around her, and they walked down the ridge together in the golden light. And the station was below them with the lamps already lit against the coming dark. In the months and years that followed, the Dry Creek Station became something Georgia had not precisely planned and had entirely built. It became a landmark along the Southern Trail routes, known for its reliability and its proprietors, the woman who knew the territory as well as anyone alive, and the surveyor who could map any piece of it on request. The trail guide they had written together went through 2 revised editions, the second of which included George's name on the cover alongside Ralph's, which had required a brief but decisive argument with the printer in Hadley, who had found the inclusion unusual, and who had been persuaded by George's calm and thorough explanation of why he was wrong. Ralph's survey practice grew steadily. He was methodical and accurate and completely honest in his work, which in a territory still sorting out its land claims was a combination that generated both clients and trust. He rode out on survey assignments 2 or 3 times a month and came home every time with the same directness of feeling that he brought to everything, glad to be back, interested in everything that had happened in his absence, unhurried in his return to the rhythm of the station and the family. They had a second child in 1884. A daughter they named Me, after the rancher's wife who had been their witness and their friend. Me Ford arrived in the same April dawn manner as her brother, loud and determined, with Ralph's gray eyes and George's particular expression of complete certainty about everything, which Ralph pointed out somewhat helplessly was going to make the future very interesting. Georgia looked at her daughter and felt the same enormous wave she had felt with Daniel, love and terror and gratitude. And this time the terror was marginally less overwhelming, and the gratitude was wider, because she had been practicing both for 2 years and was getting better at holding them without being swept away. Daniel Ford, who was 2 when his sister arrived, and who had inherited his uncle's gift for sudden and transformative laughter, was initially suspicious of me and then deeply devoted to her within a week, which Georgia found both charming and on brand for a boy who had his great-uncle's temperament. The station expanded in 1885. They added a second sleeping room for travelers and a small stable that could accommodate 6 horses instead of 3. And Georgia hired a young woman named Rosa Vega from Hadley to help with the cooking and the supplies, because the work had grown past what 2 adults and a set of children could reasonably manage. Rosa was 20 years old, sensible and capable and unfazed by the territory's various difficulties, and she and Georgia worked together with a practical efficiency that Georgia found deeply satisfying. Ralph designed the expansion with the same care he brought to official survey work, considering every structural angle and load-bearing and drainage requirement, because he was constitutionally incapable of approaching any built thing carelessly, and because Georgia would not have wanted him to. They stood together in the evening after the expansion was complete, the children on the porch and Rosa putting supper together inside, and looked at what the station had become, solid and functional and larger than its beginning, but recognizably the same thing Georgia had built from nothing, the same bones and spirit, expanded and improved but not replaced. Daniel would have liked this, Georgia said. He would have been insufferably proud of you, Ralph said. She laughed. He would have been. He always was, which I never understood because I did not feel like I was doing anything remarkable. You were building something real in a place that was trying to be built, Ralph said. That is always remarkable. She took his hand and they stood there in the evening light, and the territory stretched away from them in every direction, enormous and indifferent and beautiful, and they were small and present and utterly certain of each other. In 1887, a man came through the station on a southbound trail who turned out to be an editor for a territorial newspaper based in Santa Fe. He had heard about the trail guides and had tracked down the authors on his way south. He wanted to commission a column, practical information about the southern routes, current trail conditions, water sources, seasonal information, written accessibly and published monthly. Georgia accepted the commission on the spot without consulting Ralph, because she had learned by 1887 that she did not need to consult Ralph about decisions that were hers to make and that he would support completely. When she told him that evening, he said, "Of course," with the mild expression of a man who was not at all surprised and was simply waiting to hear the details. "I thought you might have thoughts about the time commitment," she said. "I have the thought that you should do it," he said. "And the thought that Rosa can handle the mornings more independently than we have been letting her, because she is entirely capable. And the thought that I would like to read every column before it goes to press, not to change anything, just because I like reading what you write." Georgia looked at him across the supper table in the lamplight, with their son eating his food with intense 5-year-old concentration and their daughter already asleep, and felt the fullness of the life she was living settle through her in a long, satisfied wave. "You are," she said, "an extraordinarily good man." "I am," he said, with a small, warm smile, "an extraordinarily good man who is also in love with the most capable woman in the New Mexico territory, which makes being extraordinarily good somewhat easier." She threw a small piece of cornbread at him. He caught it. The column ran for 4 years, and Georgia became, in a quiet and practical way, known throughout the Southern Territorial Circuit as the woman who knew the trail routes better than anyone alive, and could tell you so in plain and useful prose. She received letters at the station from readers, settlers and travelers and surveyors and families heading west, and she answered every one of them with the same thoroughness and care she applied to everything. She kept Daniel's grave on the South Ridge tended through all of it, through every season and every year. She went up regularly, sometimes alone and sometimes with the children. She told her son and daughter about their uncle with the specificity and love of someone who wants the dead to be real to the living, not a sad story but an actual person, with a laugh that arrived without warning and a gift for stone masonry, and a dream of making maps. When Daniel Ford was 6 years old, he found his father's old surveying instruments in the chest in the back room and brought them to Georgia with the expression of someone who has found something enormously important. "What are these?" he demanded. Georgia looked at the instruments and then at her son, at his dark hair and his stubborn jaw and his enormous certainty that whatever he had found mattered. "Those are your father's surveying tools," she said. "He uses them to measure land, to make precise records of where things are." "Can I learn?" Daniel said. "Ask your father," she said, and watched her son go in search of Ralph with the same purposeful energy his great uncle had once brought to laying a stone foundation, and felt the particular tenderness of a moment that was about something much larger than itself. Ralph taught Daniel to use the surveying instruments over the following months with the patient precision that characterized everything he did, and the boy was a quick and diligent student with a genuine aptitude for measurement and spatial reasoning. And Ralph reported to Georgia in the evenings that he believed their son might actually become a cartographer. "I know," Georgia said. "I have thought so since the first time I saw him looking at your maps." Ralph was quiet for a moment, understanding what she was not quite saying. "He would have loved that," Ralph said. "Yes," Georgia said, "he would have." They sat together in the evening quiet and held the fullness of it, the way their life had grown up around the loss without erasing it, accommodating it, incorporating it, carrying it forward, which was the only true way to carry anything. The years moved in the way that good years do, quickly enough that you have to consciously pause to hold them, and full enough that you do not regret their passing. The territory continued its slow, complicated process of becoming something more settled and less lawless, which Georgia watched with the mixed feelings of a woman who had built something essential in the interstitial wilderness, and who understood that necessity and civilization were not always the same thing. The railroad came closer. The trail traffic shifted and evolved. The station adapted, as Georgia adapted everything, by understanding what was actually needed and providing it directly and without sentiment about what had been needed before. By 1890, the Dry Creek Station was no longer primarily a rest stop for passing travelers, though it remained that as well. It had become a working property. Survey office, trail information center, postal waypoint, small but productive kitchen garden, and the home of two people who had built it together from the inside out and who had never, not for a single day since the night by the fire, failed to understand what they had in each other. Miss Ford was 6 in 1890, and she had decided by that age that she intended to run things, which her mother found entirely reasonable, and her father found both charming and slightly exhausting. She had her mother's precision and her father's steadiness, and a particular brand of 7-year-old authority that showed every sign of maturing into something that would leave a mark on the territory. Georgia took her children up to the South Ridge on a clear October morning in 1890, which was a thing she did annually on Daniel's birthday in October, a small private ceremony that had become simply a part of their family's year. They sat by the grave in the morning light, the two children and Georgia and Ralph, and Georgia told her brother about the year, about the column and the station and the survey contracts and Daniel's progress with the instruments and me's absolute certainty about everything. She told him about the territory as it was becoming, the changes and the challenges, about the railroad and the settlement, and the ways the wild edges were slowly becoming something more contained. She told him that the South Ridge was still the same, still the view of 50 miles and the sky going on forever, and that she came here because he had loved this spot, and because she wanted to love it in his place as well as her own. She told him that she was happy, that it was the real and complete kind, that she had learned to hold joy and loss in the same hands without either of them crushing the other, and that she thought this was one of the things a person could only learn by living it, and that she was grateful to have lived long enough and loved deeply enough to know it. The October wind moved through the grass on the ridge with the sound that she had long since come to think of as her brother's answer, patient and constant and wide as the territory itself. Ralph put his arm around her on the south ridge, and their children sat in the grass beside the cross with the easy comfort of children at a familiar place, and the morning light of October lay over the New Mexico territory in long, clear lines of gold. They went back down the ridge together, the four of them, the station visible below with its solid stone walls and expanded stable and kitchen garden, and the flag Ralph had put up on the east corner that caught the wind now and moved against the blue sky. Georgia looked at it from the bottom of the ridge and thought that this was what survival looked like when it was given the room to become something. Not the absence of loss, but the presence of a life built honestly beside it. Not the forgetting of what was buried, but the willingness to let someone know where it was. To point to the place and say, "Here, this is what I have been carrying." And to find in the saying of it that the carrying was different when it was shared. She had a life. She had a partner who was present and honest and completely himself, who loved her with the same precise care he brought to every important thing. She had a son who was going to be a cartographer and who laughed like his gray tuncle, sudden and transforming. She had a daughter who was going to run something significant and who had her mother's eyes and her own entirely original certainty about the world. She had 40 acres of New Mexico territory that she knew better than she knew any other place on earth. She had Daniel's grave on the South Ridge, and she had Daniel's name carried forward in her son, and she had the 3 years of survival that had made her who she was, the strength of them and the cost of them, both equally real, both equally hers. Ralph came up beside her at the gate of the station where she had stopped walking and was looking at the flag moving in the morning wind. "All right," he asked, in the quiet way he asked everything. She looked up at him, at his gray eyes in the October light, amber brown in the warm fall morning, as familiar now as the territory itself. "I am," she said. "I genuinely am." He smiled, the slow, full warmth of it, and she took his hand as they walked through the gate of the Dry Creek station, their home, back into the bright and ordinary and extraordinary middle of their life. The wind off the desert moved through the kitchen garden and caught the flag and lifted it against the clear New Mexico sky, and the October morning was wide and golden and entirely real, and Georgia Shepard Ford walked forward into it with open hands.